Welcome to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Rosensweet, mom of 3 young people, peaceful parenting coach, and your cheerleader and guide on all things parenting. Each week, we'll cover the tools, strategies, and support you need to end the yelling and power struggles and encourage your kids to listen and cooperate so that you can enjoy your family time. I'm happy to say we have a great relationship with our 3 kids. The teen years have been easy and joyful, not because we're special unicorns, but because my kids were raised with peaceful parenting. I've also helped so many parents just like you stop struggling and enjoy their kids again. I'm excited to be here with you today and bring you the insight and information you need to make your parenting journey a little more peaceful. Let's dive into this week's conversation. Hey all, before we dive into today's episode, I am so excited to share with you something that I've been working on for months behind the scenes. And more through my coaching and through my work with you in our communities and my courses, I have found that a lot of you with kids who are if you know me, you hear me talking about the kids who are more or extra. We've decided to call those complex kids. Those are the kids that are sensitive, strong-willed, spirited, or neurodivergent. A lot of people with your kids like that, you also hear me talk about the 20%, a lot of you are feeling like you must not be doing something right because, the books say, if you do this, if you empathize, your child will melt into your arms in tears. Well, it doesn't work like that for you. Or maybe you feel like, I was just talking to somebody yesterday whose child was being, we'll say defiant, but also, we can also just say, saying what he wanted. And she felt like I must be doing something wrong and not connecting enough. So if you've ever felt like that, you're doing all of the things and your child is still hard, and of course they're wonderful, but you look around and you see nobody else is working as hard as you are, and maybe you're just wondering if you're doing something wrong. Well, we have been seeing that so much, and you're not doing anything wrong. You are doing all of the things, and it's not because there's something wrong with you or with your child. You have a kid that is harder than the average kid, right? You've got one of those complex, more or extra kids. And if that's you, or even if you're just interested, I guess, I don't want to leave anyone out, we have put together an amazing free parenting conference for you, a summit, sometimes that people call them. It's called Flourish with Your Complex Child, and it is happening in a few weeks. We just opened registration today, so make sure to hop over to sararosensweet.com/summit. We'll put a link to that in the show notes right there on your phone. You can hop over, register for free, and we're going to have almost 30 amazing experts. I have recruited some of the top people in their fields from around the world to participate in this and to help us understand our complex child. We've got 2 days on understanding your complex child. We have a day of supporting your child out in the world. We have a day on supporting ourselves and understanding ourselves as parents of complex children. I can't tell you how excited I am about this. Really, I'm just smiling right now. Corey's been listening to the interviews. She keeps texting me and saying, these are so amazing. We are going to be helping so many parents. She gets all teary when she's talking about it. So please hop over to sararosensweet.com/summit to sign up for free. You'll also have the opportunity to upgrade to a paid all access pass for forever access to the recordings, plus a ton of bonuses from the speakers. As I said, you don't have to. It's free if you don't want to do that. But if you do want to upgrade and really give yourself time to soak in these interviews, you can do that as well. So I hope to see you inside the summit. Today's episode is a guest expert interview with science journalist Melinda Wenner Moyer, who is also the author of the book, How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Blankety Blanks, except for she does not say blankety blanks. We had such a good conversation about what the research shows about raising great kids. And we dive into all sorts of topics from, raising kids who aren't sexist to raising kids who have a healthy sense of self-worth. It was a really interesting conversation and a very interesting book. Before we dive into our conversation, I just wanted to share a review with you. This review is from Jude in the UK, and Jude says, I love this podcast. Sarah has really helped me in my peaceful parenting journey. When you feel like you're swimming against the tide, it's so good to listen to like-minded people. This podcast reminds me that the way I'm choosing to parent can be hard work, but is totally worth it. And Jude, I 100% agree. The reason why we have this podcast is both to help you all out there, remind you that you're not alone, and really support you in that hard work. If you would like to support us in the podcast, I would love it if you left us a review on Apple or rate us on Spotify. And also, I would love for you to check out our Patreon account. You can, for a small monthly donation, you can support the podcast. And there's another level where you're going to get access to a weekly Q&A with me and my coaches. So definitely check out patreon.com/peacefulparenting if you would like to support the podcast. And also, a way that we can support you is with my free How to Stop Yelling at Your Kids course. So that is at sararosensweet.com/yelling. And it's a free course. If you do it, you will find great improvements in your self-regulation. And we have to remember that in peaceful parenting, we always start with self-regulation. That does not mean that we don't get upset or frustrated or annoyed with our kids. It means that we figure out how to calm ourselves so that we can respond when things are hard rather than react out of anger, frustration, or annoyance. And again, if you'd like to check out that free course, it's at sararosensweet.com/yelling. And support us on Patreon would be amazing. Leave us a review and a rating. And all of these things are ways that we can reach more families and help to spread the peaceful parenting message. So before I keep you any longer, let's get to our guest, Melinda. Hi, Melinda. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you here. So can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. I am a science and parenting journalist. So I have been writing about science and health and medicine for, almost 20 years now. It's really crazy to think about. And when I had kids, which was 12 years ago, really, I had so many questions that I didn't know the answers to. And I started to wonder whether science might help me answer my own parenting questions. And I found that it could answer a lot of them, not all of them, of course. So I started doing a lot more parenting writing and specifically like science-based parenting writing. I wrote a column for Slate for many years, a science-based parenting column for Slate. And then eventually realized I kind of wanted to write a parenting book. So I have also written a parenting book that's really focused on raising good kids. And I still write a lot of parenting stuff. I still write a lot of science, and I have a Substack newsletter where I write about a lot of different things related to parenting. So I'm kind of all over the place, I feel like, but
Okay.
The theme is like parenting and science.
Awesome. Well, and I think the way we'll put a link to your Substack in the show notes if people are interested in that. And the way I found you is because my dad sent me a New York Times article that you wrote. And I think the headline was something like, why, if your kids are rude, it might not be such a bad thing, or something along
Yep.
those lines.
Yep.
And when I read it, I was like, oh, this is, exactly what we teach parents in peaceful parenting, that, when you raise kids who believe that they have the right to exist, basically, and they might say things that, kids of yesteryear wouldn't have dared to voice their opinions or say something against an adult. It's actually good because it shows that they're not afraid of their parents, or they're not afraid of the adults that they're with, and that the authoritative parenting approach, which is what you talk about in your book, and that's synonymous with peaceful parenting, which is what I teach and practice, and that you often have kind of messier behavior in the younger years as kids are learning niceties and social norms and all that stuff, but when they're not afraid, you see a little bit of that more.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I remember that article, it went viral and it made some people mad, and it made other people very happy and relieved. So I'm glad that you were one of the latter.
No, and I sent out I wrote a newsletter about it, and I sent out a link to it and a couple of quotes from the article. I'm like, see, a science journalist is saying that what we're doing is actually backed by science. So it's really great to have that. And your book, I'll say that, and of course I saw the title of your book, which immediately grabbed me, which is, I'm going to not say the actual title because this is a kid-friendly podcast, but How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Blankety Blanks is the title of your book, which of course I'm sure grabbed a lot of people.
Yes, it was. It is a provocative title, I know, but it's really funny. Like we kept my editor and I kept trying to come up with other titles that would be a little more maybe inclusive, not having a bad word in them. And I really just couldn't come up with anything that really captured what I was trying to say. So we stuck with it, but certainly I have that's been a bit provocative. Some people don't like it, but that's okay. They don't have to read it.
That's true. Well, so I got a couple of things I wanted to ask you about. One is, what was the most surprising thing that you learned in your, let me just, for people who haven't read the book, Melinda has got maybe, 12 chapters around where you've got them divided into different categories. For example, talking about sex or screens or siblings. You've got just some very general topics that you dive into the research and what the research shows and sort of what you learned from the research. So what was the most surprising thing that you learned when you did the research for this book?
Oh, that's a great question, because there were so many surprising things. I mean, just as an aside, like one of the reasons that I decided to write the book was because I realized I had all of these misconceptions about how to foster certain, characteristics in kids, and the research like really didn't always support what my beliefs were. And so I kind of wanted to bring light to those. For some reason, the surprising thing that's coming to me right now was related to bullying, because I knew I wanted to have a chapter in the book that really dug into the science of what we know about bullying and why do kids bully, and how do we sort of decrease the chances that our kids will engage in bullying. And, I had always had this belief that bullies were kind of like bad apples. Like kids who engaged in bullying were just like nasty kids. And, I grew up in a school where there was a bully who, to me at that moment in time, did seem like just like a really not a nice kid all around. Right. And I think we have these sort of black and white ideas about like bullies are just kind of these bad apples. And so when we come to it with that assumption, we assume like, well, my kid who's a good kid could never, ever engage in bullying. And I think that's not a good assumption to have, because what the research suggests is that bullying is really, there's like a spectrum, just like kind of with anything else. There are really great kids who engage in bullying sometimes, and they might only do it occasionally. And then they might also be bullied the next, day. And that there are reasons that kids engage in bullying that just have to do with underdeveloped skills, that it's really not a reflection of character, that kids can engage in bullying because they, for instance, have trouble taking another person's perspective. So this is a skill called theory of mind, which I talk a lot about in the book. And that's basically the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And it's a skill that really takes a while to develop in childhood. As adults, we think like, isn't it easy to, know that another person can have a different idea or have a different experience than I'm having right now? But for kids, it's tricky.
Honestly, some adults have trouble with that, though.
Yes, that is also true. Many adults, I think. But yeah, so bullying, I learned, is often a reflection of just, underdeveloped skills. And it really isn't a reflection of character. And when I saw this research, it really kind of blew open my mind, and I became much more intentional with my own kids about talking about bullying, about trying to do things that would develop theory of mind skills in them, and not just assuming that like I don't need to worry about my kids engaging in bullying because they're good kids, because we know that great kids sometimes engage in bullying, and we just still need to be aware that it can happen.
When my daughter was in 4th grade, she had a really difficult year of some other girls being quite unkind to her that used to be her friends. And it was, super painful, as it is for parents. And then one day she came home and told me about how she had been intentionally unkind to one of those girls. And she will tell you today, she's almost 16, she'll tell you today, if I said to her, when was the only time I've ever been really angry at you? She'll say, oh, in 4th grade when I did this thing. Like, I was so angry. Like, and it really, honestly, like, it takes a lot to get me angry. I was so upset because I just thought, how could she have turned around and done this horrible thing that, it wasn't like on the scale of things, horrible, like, intentionally, like leaving someone out or talking about them. I can't even remember what it was, but it was like that Mean Girl stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And I ran out and bought the Rosalind Wiseman book, Queen Bees and Wannabes, which is all about sort of the Mean Girl stuff. And it's a very long-winded way of saying what I learned from that book. She says, your daughter will have other girls be mean to her, and she will be mean to other girls, right? Like it's what you're saying. It's like that learning thing of how to be in relationship. And, I wouldn't have gone as far as to call any of this stuff bullying that she was experiencing, but just, yeah, good kids can make choices sometimes or do things that really surprise you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I've had a similar experience, with a phone call from the principal once with something that my son had said on the school bus that I was also very, very upset about. Yeah, you don't think that's going to be your kid, but
Mm-hmm.
it often, I mean, I think it's kind of inevitable that at some point your kid's going to do something unkind. I mean, that's just human nature. And sometimes it's a reflection of, lack of impulse control. I mean, and emotional regulation skills. I mean, these are things that are all developing in kids for a long time. So our kids are going to sometimes make poor choices.
Yeah. So bullying was actually one of the things that I had jotted down in my notes that I wanted to talk to you about. So what else did you learn about bullying that is useful for parents to know?
Yeah. So another thing that I thought was really interesting is that it is often the parents of kids who engage in bullying are often the parents who think their kids are least likely to bully. So this was something that was really eye-opening. And I feel like I see this playing out in in real life a lot. Like there was a social emotional learning speaker who came to our school just last week, a couple weeks ago, and I kind of looked around at the parents who were at this lecture and I was like, wow, these are the parents of kids who kind of least need to be here in some ways. Like they have, they already have educated themselves about this. And I know they have conversations with their kids about these things. And some of the parents I think who could, really stand to learn what some of what she was saying weren't there, maybe because they kind of assumed they didn't need to be. So, I think again, it kind of comes down to like, if you have this assumption that you don't need to worry at all about your child ever being unkind, that you should really kind of check that assumption. So what I recommend based on the interviews I did with anti-bullying researchers is, to have conversations with your kids about bullying and what it can look like. And, I think little things that we can do to increase our kids' theory of mind skills can be very, very helpful. So one way to do that is really to emphasize, like to tie your kids' choices to the effects that their choices have on other people. So one example I give in the book is, whenever I step on my kids' Legos, which I feel like happens like 80 times a week, instead of just saying, or I guess after I step on the Legos, I'm also like, can you please pick up your Legos? I will often say, could you please clean up your Legos because otherwise I'm going to step on one again and that really hurts. And so I'm constantly trying to think about, when I'm asking my kids to do something or I notice something about what their choices are, is trying to explain to them how those choices affect me or affect their siblings or maybe affect, their family or their classmates so that they start to recognize that, they don't live in just like this little bubble where what they do, doesn't really affect anyone else, but rather that their choices can have these, ripple effect ramifications that we kind of need to make them aware of. So that's a really powerful way of building theory of mind that then, can help to reduce the risk that your child will engage in bullying. So that's another big one.
I just last night saw Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, the
Oh,
new movie. And I was thinking about just when you were talking that I don't know if you remember the book very well, but the girl Margaret, there's a girl in their class who's really well developed and tall, and the other girls are really mean to her, and she's really ostracized. And Margaret goes through this epiphany of like recognizing the effects that this has had on this other girl, right? It was a pretty powerful subplot, I thought, of the movie. It was really like she was a good kid. Margaret was a good kid, but she did engage in this really like mean behavior towards the other girl because she couldn't picture how it was making the other girl feel until she actually had an interaction with the other girl where she learned that and she felt terrible, right? So as you're saying, that is like that theory of mind, like how kids' actions affect other people, whether it's being ostracized or stepping on their mom, stepping on their Lego, right?
yeah. And there's so many ways that you can have these conversations. I feel like, I mean, I'm sort of constantly trying to think about ways that I can help my child see somebody else's perspective. Like I'm just thinking of one other example from a school bus, because we were talking about school bus and bullying, was when my son came home upset one day because the school bus driver got mad at him for being too loud in the school bus. And my son was like, why should he care how loud I am? And I was like, that's a really good question. Let's think about this. Let's think about like, what do you think the school bus driver, like, what's their main job and what do they need in order to get their job done? Like they really care about your safety and they want to get you home safely. And that means they have to focus and, really pay attention to what's going on the road. And, maybe being loud distracts the school bus driver and makes it harder for him to focus. And he's worried that he might get in an accident, so like the ways in which we can kind of open our kids' eyes to, wow, what's the little like universe that this other person is living in, and what are they, what are their goals and priorities, and how does my behavior sometimes affect that? Just really trying to connect those dots, I think, can be super, super helpful.
Yeah, totally. And I think that that's really important. I know you have one of your sections is raising kids who aren't selfish, and I think it's actually in that part where you talk about the induction. Is that the right word? Right? Which is what you're sort of talking about, the reason behind the request. And I was just coaching yesterday a family who was having trouble with their 11-year-old doing the jobs that he'd already agreed on. And we talked about, I think it's helpful to have a conversation with him about when he says he's going to do the dishwasher, why it's important that he does it by, 5:30, which is when you want to start making dinner, and helping him see how his inaction of doing the dishwasher is affecting the parents, because then they have a dirty kitchen and they can't get dinner started on time. And the parents, I think, because this is such a not intuitive way necessarily of parenting, like that, the explanations and talking about, instead of just do it, or like just because you have to, or because I said so, or whatever, they were kind of like, oh, that makes so much sense. Like help him understand, like, you're not just being mean and trying to take him away from his book or his Lego or whatever else he's doing. Like, there's a reason why we're asking kids to do the things we're asking them to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I that makes me so happy that that's how you coached the family. I think it can be really, really powerful. And I do think that a lot of parents just sort of don't think about that, or maybe don't recognize the value of it, because maybe they were parented in a way that was just like, do this and don't ask questions, and totally don't talk back. And we don't recognize that actually it's really valuable to explain and to talk through and to help our kids understand why we're asking the things.
And that's why in Peaceful Parenting, we talk about how, because that's sort of like one of the things that we always talk about in Peaceful Parenting is helping them understand the why, but also why it's so much more work. I'll be right up front about it. Like, this is a lot more work than just the do it or you won't get your iPad, right?
It is more work. It is. Yeah.
So, but then you're raising kids who have the intrinsic motivation to do the right thing rather than just because that, they're what they're going to get or not get. So it's a long game. So a couple of things. What did you find was the most useful thing that you learned? Like, what do you find yourself coming as a parent? What do you find yourself coming back to?
Yeah, that's another great question. Let's see. I think one big theme from the book that I kept hearing from researchers who were in all different kinds of fields, studying all different kinds of issues, was that it's important to lean into conversations you don't really want to have with your kids. So I think there's so many topics that we as parents want to protect our kids from. And we think, my kid doesn't need to know about sex, and my kid doesn't need to know about race and racism and sexism. And, my kid doesn't need to know what's going on in the world because it's scary or it's, difficult to explain. It's really nuanced. And so we really often try to shield our kids from these topics. And it's really well-meaning. I completely understand why we do it. I mean, I used to do it too. But the problem is that can really backfire, because kids, first of all, us not talking about topics does not actually protect kids from those topics. All it really means is that they're not getting the information about those topics from us. Mm-hmm. So they might be getting it from their friends, and that information might not be accurate. They might be getting it from the media, from, things they see online. And who knows how it's being framed, whether it's thorough, whether it might actually be framed in a way that goes against our own values. So I found, over and over again, what researchers said to me was there are often age-appropriate ways to talk about pretty much anything with our kids. And if we feel like our kids might be being exposed to issues in some way, then it actually really is important to at least broach the topic with them. And, if nothing else, to say, have you heard anything about what's been going on in the news? And if you have, I'd love to talk to you about it. Or if you have any questions, I'm here for you, at the very least, to sort of just put yourself out there as a parent saying, I am available. I'm willing to talk about this topic. I'm willing to talk about these issues if you have any questions at all. And I find that often my kids really do want to engage with difficult things, and they come back to me with more questions and more, they're eager to talk about things that I would maybe initially think I shouldn't talk to them about. So that's something that I kept coming up against over and over again.
Yeah. I mean, and there were a couple times in your book where you talked about, when you don't talk about something, that's sending a message too, right? When you're not talking about something. And I thought that especially with the race and gender stuff, that was really interesting, that you talked about, parents reading books that were specifically like picture books that were specifically written to show children diversity and skin color. But if the parents didn't specifically talk, if they said things like, everybody's different, or like those generalizations, that kids are not going to learn from that, even though it seems obvious to us, but that you have to actually say, look, this child has brown skin and this child has light brown skin. And, this is called, I don't remember exactly the words that you're supposed to use, but specifically talking about race and racial differences, and not just saying like, we're all different and isn't it wonderful?
Right. Yes. Yes. We tend to talk about race with these like vague sort of platitudes. And we think that our kids are getting the message like, yeah, that, oh, people can be different, but they're all great. And, we think, oh, I've just talked to my kid about racism, but
Yeah.
they do not, get that.
I saw this lovely video. I think it must have been, I don't know, on Instagram or something, but this video of these little kids, and they had very obvious differences between them. Like one was in a wheelchair and one wasn't, or one was black and one was white. And then the interviewers asked the kids, what's different about you from each other? And the kids said things like, well, he loves spaghetti sauce and I don't, or like these really like sweet, like, anyhow, it just made me think that as what you just said about, to us, it seems like the differences are obvious, but for kids, we really have to talk about it explicitly.
Yeah. Yeah. And on the point you made earlier about our silence speaking volumes, I think, yeah, that's especially true with something like race, where kids can very easily see that race matters in our society. They see that there are power differences in society where, white people have more power. They notice that, only one of our presidents has been black. And if that's true and they're seeing that it matters and we just aren't talking about it, they absolutely get a message from that like mom and dad are not okay talking about this thing, which clearly is important in some way in the world. And then when we don't talk about it, they try to understand it on their own.
Yes.
And in doing so, I mean, the obvious thing, if you're a kid and you don't know any better and you don't know anything about structural racism, if you see a society in which white people have a lot of power and black and brown people don't, then, what you're going to conclude is that, well, maybe white people are just better and smarter and, intrinsically more powerful. So that's why we have to absolutely talk to them about racism and say, this is the reason that we see these power differences. It's not because white people are better. It's because of racism. And let's talk about why that is and what racism is. So it's really important. I mean, kids will come to these really biased conclusions based on what they're seeing in the world unless we come out and we talk to them about it ourselves.
Yeah. And it's, I remember when the whole George Floyd Black Lives Matter thing was really hot, and we were talking about it in my parenting Facebook group, and parents were saying things like, well, I don't know why I have to tell my kids about this stuff, and I don't want them to learn about all these bad things. And like, that is such a place of white privilege too, right? Of
Yes.
Making a choice that you don't want to talk about that stuff. And as you point out, not talking about racism is upholding white supremacy, basically, because of those assumptions, because of how kids learn, because they're always trying to make sense of their world around them. And as you said, if they don't have another explanation, they're going to make up their own explanations.
Exactly. Yeah. No, you're exactly right. These decisions to not talk about it are not just bad for our kids, but I mean, they uphold they uphold racism. They are white supremacist decisions in a
Yeah.
way. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And that also, I saw that play out in the what you talked about in your book too, with gender and with sexism too, right? Like that, not talking about things, and the way that this is slightly different, but it's still on the theme of not talking about things. Then kids draw their own conclusions about genders and about who has more power and about what each gender can do or should do. Can you talk a little bit about that, about one of the about some of the stuff that you learned, especially now? I think it's interesting as we've got so much more talk about pronouns. And, I started thinking one of the things I'm just to steal from what you're probably going to say, one of the things you talked about, best practice, is to talk about kids rather than boys and girls. Like when you're, oh, look at that kid over there, instead of like, look at that boy over there, just to avoid some, I want you to expand on this, but just the idea of, not labeling people. And I use they all the time in my writing as singular pronoun, just because I think it sounds better now rather than he or she, and to recognize that's not always how people fit in, what they fit into anyhow. But I love that it also is affirming that we're not so, I don't know, we're just not just two groups. But if you can just speak a little bit to the stuff you learned about gender and sexism.
Yeah. So gender is similar to race in certain ways, in that kids certainly see that there's a gender hierarchy in our society, just like they see a racial hierarchy, and they are going to make inferences from it. So they will see that there's never been a woman president, for instance. And this is like a heartbreaking study, but I talked about a study in the book in which researchers basically asked kids, why haven't there been women presidents? And kids were saying things like, well, women can't be president. They wouldn't be good at it. They're not as smart, just really crazy stuff that illustrates, that these are the conclusions that kids make when they look around and they see that men have a lot of power and women don't. It's like, oh yeah, it must be men are better, right? And so kids are starting to internalize this from a very young age, from around the age of 5 or 6. And the difference, though, between race and gender that's interesting is, whereas we as a society tend to not talk about skin color and race, which is sending this message to kids of like, why aren't people talking about this thing that's clearly important? With gender, we emphasize gender all the time because, as you said, we have different pronouns for people with different genders. We have different sports teams. We have different aisles in the toy store. We have different Happy Meal toys. I mean, there are all these ways in which we are telling kids that boys and girls are very different. And that is not a great message, because when you're telling kids, first of all, when they're seeing that there is this hierarchy, and you're telling your kids over and over again through the words you're using and the things that, they're seeing, that boys and girls, are very distinct, then they are really going to start to internalize that, wow, like, there must just be these like biological differences that are so important between girls and boys. And that just sort of further reinforces this idea that, that must mean that men are just better and very, very different from girls. And so that's not great. So it's really hard, though, because how do we push against this when like our society is built in a very gendered way? It's really hard. But one way we can push against this is by not using male female pronouns as much. So when you see a group of girls playing, you don't say like, look at those girls, you say, look at those kids. And teachers, especially, I know a lot of teachers like to split kids up by gender and say, okay, boys on this side, girls on the other. My daughter talks about how they have boys versus girls at PE all the time. Or they say boys and girls stand up. I mean, all these ways that we emphasize that these genders are different, it just sort of reinforces like these gender biases. So the more that we can, as you say, use the word they and talk about kids rather than girls and boys, that's helpful. Also, encouraging cross-gender friendships. So, not just having your daughter play with girls, but, encouraging her to have play dates with boys. I mean, the more that we can spend time, that kids can spend time with kids of other genders, the more they recognize that actually we're not that different. Boys and girls aren't that different. And there's research on that. So that's another helpful way of kind of pushing against it. But it is really, really hard to do.
It's so insidious.
It really is. It's
Yeah.
built into everything.
Yeah, yeah. One thing I love about a good book, and yours definitely has that, is the lots of anecdotes, and some of the anecdotes, and especially the race and gender chapters, were really shocking and sad, and some of the things that little kids, those conclusions that they draw. I remember just on the why didn't we have women presidents? And I think you said that some preschoolers even thought it was illegal for women to be president.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, which is totally wild. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit here to the sort of one more thing that I wanted to ask you about. And the book is wonderful. I think everybody should read it. The one thing that I found really also kind of a big, I don't know, shocking is not the right word, but sort of disturbing takeaway was in your chapter on self-esteem, when you talk about the results on kids of parents who put a lot of pressure on them. And, when we talk about self-esteem and peaceful parenting, we talk a lot about, well, it really matters about not what other people think of you. That's not self-esteem. And I know you talked about praise, which is also something we talk about a lot, but how you see yourself. So what are some of the things that you found that were disturbing about kids and when parents put a lot of pressure on them to be successful? And B, what are some true ways that we can raise kids who do have that good sense of healthy self-worth? And also, actually, I'm going to add one more question in there. Can you speak briefly on, I found really interesting what you talked about, the difference between a kid who is a narcissist and a kid who had healthy self-worth? Because I think a lot of parents do worry about that line. Like, just like if I raise my kid to think that they're, worthy and lovable even when they mess up, is that like raising someone who's entitled or doesn't care about other people? So can you just talk about the distinction that you made there?
Yeah. So I knew when I was writing my book that self-esteem needed to be in there because, I was like, self-esteem has to be related to kids' behavior and choices in some way, but I didn't really know how. And I didn't know much about the science on self-esteem. So I was really surprised by a lot that I found. And yes, one of the things I came to it with was this idea of like, well, gosh, I want my kid to have healthy self-esteem. I assume that's good for them. But like, if I fill their self-esteem bucket too high, is that going to cause them to be a narcissist? And how does narcissism develop? And so I reached out to some researchers who study the development of narcissism. And it was very reassuring because they said, no, 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 no. They said narcissism develops on a totally different path from, healthy self-esteem. You can't just like overfill your kid's self-esteem bucket. Narcissism is complicated and it can develop in different ways. But, one risk factor for narcissism is when parents really sort of refuse to see anything wrong ever that their kid does. So they like put their kid on a pedestal and they think like, oh my gosh, my kid is so wonderful, even though, they're like hitting another kid over the head with a bat right now. Like they won't step in and ever speak to their kid and try to, try to teach them, proper behavior.
Your funny thing was if they're throwing dog poop at you and you still think they're wonderful.
Yeah. So it's like they put their kids on this pedestal. Their kid can do no wrong. They never critique, what their kids' choices are, have conversations like that. And then, I think there's a bunch of other ways that kids can become narcissists that have to do with, more like overly harsh parenting as well, can sometimes lead kids to narcissism in a kind of convoluted way. But basically, the good news is like you kind of have to be doing some. I don't think anybody listening to your podcast is going to be raising a narcissist because there are some really like fundamental parenting mistakes that lead to it. So I found that very reassuring.
Well, and you talked about narcissism as like of holding people over other people and then operating in a way that always had that be the case, right?
Yes.
Did I get that right?
Yes. So narcissists tend to, even if they talk about themselves as if they think they're wonderful, they're constantly comparing themselves to other people. And that is how they sort of get their self-worth. And narcissists they're not necessarily actually really high in self-esteem. They can be quite low in self-esteem sometimes. There's different kinds of narcissists, as I said, but sometimes it really does reflect like a deep insecurity and they're constantly trying to make themselves seem better than others as a way to prove to themselves that they are great when, that's not actually, that's not a sign of good, healthy self-esteem. So yeah, it's a complicated construct, but I think that your listeners are
Yeah,
probably
probably
not
not.
raising narcissists. Yeah.
Okay, so talk to me about the part of the book that you were talking about when parents put a lot of pressure on their kids to be successful in those external ways, like high grades, scoring the most goals, like those kinds of things, and how that affects kids.
Yeah. So when I started trying to figure out, okay, well, what does fuel healthy versus versus very low self-esteem, I came across this body of research that I had no idea existed, which was really quite alarming. And it involved mostly kids from, families of privilege who, especially kids who go to schools that are kind of what they call high achieving schools. And the researchers have found that kids in these families who go to these schools have a lot of self-esteem problems, and they are more likely to be depressed and anxious and smoke cigarettes and marijuana and do drugs and drink and engage in delinquent behavior, like all sorts of things, compared with like the average child, and even compared with like inner city kids from low income families. And when the researchers were trying to figure out, well, why are these really privileged kids struggling so much with self-esteem, what they found was really the source of the problem was pressure on these kids to perform, to excel, to succeed, to get good grades, to get on that varsity soccer team, to get the lead in the school play, all these things that are so well meaning. Like, we want our kids to do well in life. And we want them to be successful in childhood and then get into a good college. And I mean, I understand, and I do it too. I mean, I worry about my kids' grades, more than I should. But what the research finds is that when we're putting pressure on our kids to excel, kids tend to interpret that as that our love for them is contingent on their performance and what they do and not who they are. And that is really dangerous for kids. When kids feel like their value as a human being and how much they deserve to be loved is based on what they do at school or what they do in extracurriculars, then they are never really going to feel good about themselves, just, as like,
because of who they are.
Because of who they are. And they really start to tie their value to what they do rather than who they are. And that is really, really dangerous. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the good news is there are some ways that we can, push against this. Obviously, like, tamping down pressure on our kids is important, but also, just finding ways throughout the day to communicate to our kids that we love them unconditionally can be so, so powerful. And so that might mean, at bedtime saying to your kid, I love you so much, and I want you to know that I will always love you no matter what you do or don't do, no matter what mistakes you make. I will always love you as much as I love you now. And, that is to the moon and back. And that's really powerful for kids to hear, because they do, otherwise start to think of like, well, maybe mom won't love me as much if I don't get good grades on this math test, or maybe, maybe dad will love me more if I get a goal at this game. Like, we don't want them thinking that way. And the best way to counteract that is really to make sure they know that, like, we will love them as much as we do, no matter what they do.
When my oldest son was little, he asked me, would you still love me if I did something really bad? And I said, yes, I would still love you if you did something really bad. And he said, what if I killed someone? And I said, I would still love you if you killed someone. And he said, what if I killed my brother?
Keep upping the stakes here.
And I said, I would be really upset with you, but I would still love you. It was very funny, though. It was really cute. He was probably about 6. But yeah, funny. And I was, as I was reading your book, there was some research that you talked about where kids were asked to the 6 things of like, what's the most important things to my parents? Like, that I'm a kind person, that I try to help people, that I get good grades, that I get into like the best college. There was like sort of 6, I think 3 were more external and 3 were more like about character. And I found myself wanting to like show them to my kids and say like, okay, rate these. What do you think would be the most important? Because I think what a lot of the research shows, what I've read in your book, and also, do you know the book, The Self-Driven Child?
Yes.
Yeah. So Ned and Bill talk about, asking groups of like high school students or college students, what is the most important thing to your parents, that you're happy or that you get good grades? And the kids all say good grades. right?
Mm-hmm.
So the message I think that we're sending our kids might be one that's very different than the message we mean to send them. And to your point about, the kind of questions that you ask them too, like, instead of the first thing out of your mouth, what was the mark you got on the math test today, is like, hey, did you have fun at school? I mean, I'm just randomly making things up, but we do send these messages about what's the most important thing here without even realizing it.
Yeah, we really do. And I think we often just assume that, oh, well, of course my kid knows that I'll love him no matter what, and I mean, it makes sense that we kind of assume that because we know that we will love our kids no matter what, but we really have to be explicit about it. And yeah, we have to think about what messages we're sending with the little questions we ask. If the first thing you ask when your kid comes home from school is not, about how are you doing, or, how are you feeling, or what did you have fun today, but rather how did you do on your math test, then yes, like we are sending these little messages that this is what we care about the most.
And also, I think when you talk about those high achieving schools, one thing I love about the self-driven child and about their work is like showing parents and kids that success doesn't always just look like getting into the best schools or having the highest SAT scores or making the most money, but that there's so many other ways to have like a rich, successful life, like successful with a small s, I guess. And that often parents get so worried, and you talk about this in your book, parents are so anxious about, kids today are going to have to work even harder to get to where we got when we were young. But that we have to remember that good lives can look a different way, and to include a lot of that stuff in how we're talking to kids about what their futures look like.
Yes, that is so true. That's so true. Another book I love that's in this same vein is called The Parent Compass.
Okay.
And it's like, it's for, I would say more parents of tweens and teens, but it does really, get into like the college admissions race and how we can sort of push against the pressure we feel as parents to like worry so much about it, and how can we talk to our kids about things like college. It's a really great book too.
All right, I'll have to check it out. Yeah, my daughter, I've only got one kid left in school, but in high school, but she'll often be stressing about something, and I'll just say like, it doesn't matter. Like, you just need to pass. Like, I have a very, I'm like, as long as you pass this course, you're going to be fine. Like, just, you got to get your high school credits. And actually in Canada, we're in a much nicer position in that universities don't look at anything but their last year of high school grades, which is so great in terms of like the pressure piece, especially because kids often don't get it together until later in high school to, figure out what they want to do and what they're good at. So
that's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to just close out with the question that I ask all my guests, which is, if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
I would give myself the advice to stay curious with my kids, and to, when they do something that I might initially, think, oh my God, my kid just did this thing that's not okay, to approach it, the moment and my child, with curiosity rather than judgment.
Beautiful. So we'll put the link to your Substack, but where else is a good place to find you for our listeners?
Well, I have a website as well. It's melindawennermoyer.com. And I have purchase links for my book there, as well as links to the newsletter. So that's a good place to go.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been very informative and also fun to talk to you.
Thank you, Sarah. I loved speaking with you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. I hope you found this conversation insightful and exactly what you needed in this moment. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Remember that I'm rooting for you. I see you out there showing up for your kids and doing the best you can. Sending hugs over the airwaves today. Hang in there. You've got this.